and obviously any other such AI. This is primarily because you would want to look at using technology nowadays to be able to get hold of information and obviously get hold of information quickly in summarized format. All you have to keep in mind that sometimes information pulled across by AI or ChatGPT softwares tends to be slightly inaccurate. Sometimes it can be.
Yeah.
And at least from that context, what you have to do is when you do submit your, your work, then you have to keep in mind that the work is paraphrased, the work is referenced. At least you're showing the sources from which you have taken. Because currently, right now, what we do see with the people, a lot of students using ChatGPT for research, summarizing PDF documents, what it does is it obviously hallucinates. It gives you the information, but it gives you the information from a point of view of also making things up, specifically for references, for real-time examples, because it uses fictitious companies and obviously not real-world situations. So you have to make sure your sources are correct if you include them in your work, and then obviously you can't copy and paste straight away. But what you have to do is essentially ensure that you're paraphrasing and making sure that
Yeah.
the work is your own before you actually end up submitting. That is the main bit that
Yeah.
you have to do. I've done a number of courses with different universities like Anglo Ruskin. I did my master's in law. Before that, I did my MSc in accounting with University of Northampton. And I'm currently looking at pursuing my doctorate. And what has happened is that most universities are providing ChatGPT or some sort of a research-based AI software which allows students to research, and that is perfectly okay because we follow what probably universities are doing, and to a certain extent, it is useful and helpful for students to be able to do so. But you have to keep in mind that when you do submit work, as the assessments in the UK are assignment-based, there is obviously a limit to what similarity and plagiarism can be acceptable when you do submit your work
Yeah.
in terms of assignments. And those
So I have
guidelines,
to, yeah.
yeah, those guidelines you have to adhere to, because at the end of the day, anything which is coming very high up on similarity when we do scan, will be flagged up as a caution. And because these are graded qualifications, you have to keep that in mind that, and I'll show you a quick report because we are essentially just discussing. I'll show you a quick report, and essentially what you'll see is that when we do scan, as you can see here, when the scanning is
Mm-hmm.
done, if it is showing high probability, it follows the traffic light system. And obviously, if it's green, that's fine. But if it's picking up bits and pieces which are in yellow, that means it has been picked up, from some sort of website or web-related sources. But obviously, we look at it manually as well. So as we can look at this particular document, most of the document is clean. There is obviously very few places, but it is still showing that it is 36% probability, which means some of the sources which have been quoted have been paraphrased, and that is why it picks up that probability, but essentially the learner has addressed that as a concern. And plagiarism, while anything over 20% is not acceptable. So plagiarism is 7%. So we have what is called an enterprise version of the software here. And as a provider, we are required to obviously look at scanning the work. But it isn't something you don't need to worry about, because at the end of the day, if you do get do your research using any of the websites, online sources, all you have to do is make sure that you're noting the source down, you're paraphrasing it or writing it in your own words, and making sure you're including the link in the bibliography. And that would be acceptable as long as the scans do not go over 20%.
Yeah.
Now, going back to, so yeah, if it is, it's a good practice that you've started to do your assignment, because obviously, as you can see, some of the learning outcomes, in 1, 2, and 3 in particular, this unit is a bit of a loaded unit, simply because there are 5 learning outcomes, and each of the learning outcomes have at least 4 or 5 assessment criteria, simply because this is a topic which is currently up in discussion. It's a topic which is primarily of concern for all organizations, and obviously anything that we have to we bring it in terms of the material sometimes tends to be less, because there are lots of changes happening and developments happening in this area. So yeah, learning outcome 1 you've started to cover, which is good. Learning outcome 2 we discussed last time, so we understood what is cybersecurity. Then we looked at how do we look at keeping ourselves safe and other people safe, and what could be the kind of cybersecurity or attacks which could be related to cyber when we are online. Now, today, what we are looking at doing in Learning Outcome 3 is understanding the appropriate security measures to implement. I would say using software, certain I would say tools and techniques which will allow us to remain safe online when we are actually online for any sort of an activity, whether you're browsing the internet, whether you're essentially keeping your data online, or whether you are essentially interacting with websites, or in some cases, you are using certain services which are cloud-based. So we'll be looking at covering these 5 assessment criteria, which typically include types of cybersecurity attack that we have to look out for. We learned last learning outcome, what are the different types of attacks. So we talked about, if you recall, phishing, malware, DDoS. We looked at attacks which typically were related to bot and botnet. So we looked at 6 or 7 different types of attacks. So here, what are the various kinds which currently we have to be aware of? Because there are certain attacks which require a lot of preparation, and obviously they are not very common. They are, I would say, events which happen with coordinated, moves with a lot of people globally, and it is not possible to, I'll put it this way, if I rephrase, there are some attacks which typically happen wherein it's a coordinated effort by the dark net or the dark side of the web to be able to create some of those attacks. And they require a lot of preparation and obviously a lot of teaming up in terms of resources. And those we see very few, if at all they happen. But there are lots of other types of smaller attacks which are typically happening in e-commerce while we use our emails, while we store our data online. Those are the ones that we need to be aware of, and that is what we'll be discussing in assessment criteria 3.1. In the other one, we are looking at legislation related to cybersecurity, because as this field is evolving, what we also see is the government is introducing new guidelines and legislation to protect citizens and obviously data and our data and information which is put up online. So we look at some of the legislations which have been introduced by UK in particular in relation to tackling cybersecurity. Then we look at outlining policies that can be implemented in a chosen work environment. So here you would generally discuss areas or things which could be policies and practices which companies typically implement in order to keep their side of operations safe when they do operations online. So when we look at banks, for example, and I gave an example last time, which was basically some companies have what is called additional checks that they implement and software and tools that they implement, because it's a requirement to make consumers feel protected online. And in some cases, some of these institutions which are dealing with money or commerce related transactions online use some of these tools to ensure that the customer data and the customer interaction or customer transactions remain safe online. So we look at some of the policies, for example, that we follow as an organization when we do look at, obviously on the website, and I'll take 1 or 2 examples to elaborate this. Then we look at how do we look at prevention methods and what are the various prevention methods to prevent cyber attacks. So things like keeping your machine up to date or PC up to date with an antivirus software if it's Windows, making sure that you do not install any malicious programs or any softwares or programs which are in the beta release, because they might have what are called backdoor entry or codes which are not properly finalized. So alpha releases or beta releases of software. They could be also looking at ensuring that you say, for example, have implemented firewall in certain cases on your PC or enabled firewall. So we look at some of the methods through which a normal user can actually prevent, some of these cyber attacks. Then we'll in the end talk about, how to protect systems, people, and processes. So as a whole, when we look at the learning outcome 3, we start off with cyber attacks, legislation, then we look at policies for an organization, then we look at how you would prevent cyber attacks for people individually and keep their data safe, and then overall, an overall outlook in terms of people, processes, and machines that we need to protect, or systems that we need to protect in order to ensure that the data, information, or anything that you store online on the cloud, on your machine, or on your PC is actually kept safe. So let's look at going into a bit more detail with regards to discussing this learning outcome using a presentation. Now, there is a fair bit of content that we need to cover, and that typically is coming across from the unit specification, things like passcode policy. We'll discuss all these points. So these are bits and pieces that we are going to discuss when we go into, related content for this particular, learning outcome, which is understanding how to manage cybersecurity risks. Now, one of the key things that we want to get, and understand that if somebody is to ask you what is a cyber attack, we're talking about cyber security and cyber security measures. But there's another term called cyber attack. So when we do talk about, this particular term cyber attack, what we are looking at is, if we look at a very basic definition, the basic definition is it's an assault which is launched by criminals which are online. So they would be termed as cyber criminals. And this particular attack or assault that they would, or gaining access to information, unauthorized access to information systems, or any sort of information which is stored on your machine oblique, on the cloud, if they try and get access to it. When I say they, I mean people who are termed as cyber criminals because they are essentially criminals, but they are committing crimes online using software and technology. And if they do so against a computer or a network or a host of computers or devices on the network within an organization, within a house, or for example, a public place or a government office, then that would be termed as what is called a cyber attack. Now, cyber attack, what does it entail? It entails things like getting unauthorized access to information or data. Now, what is the difference between data, information, and knowledge? Data could be data which is stored on your PCs as data collected from various sources. Now, give you an example. If you do a research and you start carrying out a research, you would send out questionnaires. The questionnaires come back, and you scan them or find out the outcome of those questionnaires, and you start tabulating it into a Excel sheet, and then you store it on your PC or online in the cloud. Now, when you store that, it is information, but it does not make sense on its own. It needs to be worked on further, and that would be termed as data. Now, data to me can also be my name, date of birth, my demographics part of it, my credentials and things like that. But sometimes some part of the data in isolation might not make sense. Now, when that data is synthesized and further treated to make meaningful sense, then it will get converted into what is called information. Information could be related to, say, for example, when I look at nowadays when companies issue credit cards, they only write the long digit number. They don't write, for example, your CVC code or your issue date and expiry date, because these are parameters required essentially to use your card online. If you lose your card, then sometimes it becomes unusable or becomes difficult for you to be able to use until they have all the pieces of the information, which is your expiry date, your CVV code, or maybe in some cases, your postcode, because sometimes if you carry out transactions online, it might not work because it will send either a two-factor authentication or ask you to put your postcode where the card is actually registered. So in such cases, if somebody ends up finding a card, that is data, but because that data is not sufficient enough to be able to carry out an e-commerce transaction, that would not be useful for somebody. They would try it, but without that information, which is the CVC code, your postcode, and in some cases, the expiry or issue date of the card, it will not be usable. So data in general in a card might not be useful without these parameters. So in such cases, that becomes information. Now, when I look at information and I further process it with using, say, systems, which could be decision support systems, expert systems, or management information systems, that information can be processed into, say, for example, reports. It can be processed into something like a management report or some sort of a, I would say, detailed, let's say, detailed outcome. And again, that example of research. So you had questionnaires, but when you compile the data into the questionnaires using a software like SPSS, you would basically get to a conclusion wherein you would find what is the skewness in the data and what the data is actually contributing to, whether it's supporting the research objectives or it is not supporting the research results, not objective. And then once you use that information which has come out of the software to be able to interpret that information, which makes meaningful sense to conclude in your research, as an example, that would be termed as knowledge. So similarly, when you look at data, in the case of PCs, it could be 0 and 1 binary, but that information, when it's pulled together, and obviously pulled together in a context of, for example, an email or a document, or say, for example, a series of documents becomes information. But those series of documents, when they are, categorized, when they are, put together through a reporting system, at some stage they might produce a summarized report, and that would become knowledge for the manager or for the person in the organization if they are in management or things like that. So when you look at cyber attack, sometimes attacks are done to get hold of data. Sometimes they're done to get hold of data and information. Sometimes they're done to get hold of data, information, and knowledge. Now, a possible example that I could explain here is that, for example, if you understand a company like Huawei or Samsung or Apple launching a new phone, the activity around the launch dates, becomes quite hectic, because in the sense there could be leaks which could happen about photographs of the phone, the specification of the new phone which is coming out, and that could take the fizz out in terms of what the launch is going to be about and the curiosity which the customer is expecting. So in such cases, you would generally see, because Apple manufactures the phones in China, in factories in China and Taiwan, sometimes you get to see that closer to the release, Apple works on 3 or 4 different prototypes, but we don't know which one is going to come out. But when they do send it for manufacturing, sometimes you see leaks of photos coming out from these factories to say this is how the latest phone is going to be, or this is how the picture of the phone is. But nobody can confirm that this is the actual phone until the date of launch, because Apple only knows about it. So in such cases, when you look at that information which is coming out because of leaks, or because people trying to gain unauthorized access to the information, in such cases, you would generally see the cyber attack or incidents related to cyber attacks tend to increase, because there are people who would pay a lot of money to be able to get hold of this information. Competitors would be able to, would be interested in finding out what is being released by Apple as a company or as Samsung as a company. And in such cases, these attacks typically look at either disabling, disrupting, destroying, or controlling systems, which could basically delay the launch, or in some cases, look at essentially making this information available to people before the launch date. So in such cases, what you are going to see is a heightened activity of cyber attacks, which can happen because there's a lot of curiosity around the launch date of the new product or the new service. There are lots of different examples. This is maybe a very closely guarded secret and a very difficult example, which seldom happens. We've heard about in the news that sometimes Apple's employees, which were testing the prototype, they went to a cafe or someplace and they lost the phone or left it there. And the company then takes all possible measures to be able to recover it. But those are not attacks. Those are basically, reckless mistakes which employees are making. But attacks would be, generally, when we use the term cyber attack, it'll be something which will happen online. The reason word cyber is used for online. So if you see attacks, or attempts, if I use the word instead of attack, attempts which are made to gain access to information in an unauthorized way online, would be termed as cyber attacks. Now, why did they happen? We looked at it last time. The last assessment criteria of Learning Outcome 2.4 was, what is the reputation of cyber attackers? Why do they look at doing this attack? It is a case wherein they are. Sorry.
I just want to say, it's as well their mindset of the cyber criminal.
Correct. So it could be the mindset, it could be curiosity, it could be testing their knowledge, it could be they're getting paid by competition, it could be just that they are looking at inflicting reputational damage, or in some cases they want to get hold of this valuable information before time, because sometimes if you get hold of this information before time, then it might be more valuable in terms of commercially, in terms of money, for people like this, because they can get hold of this information and then sell it online to be able to make more money from it. So those are the reasons that we need to look at when we talk about cyber attack, and obviously why do cyber attacks essentially happen. Now, let's go into some of the assessment criteria because there's lots to cover, and some part of it, if I give you a journal background, might be repetitive. So I've covered it through the route of the assessment criteria. Now, the first one talks about explain the types of cyber attack. Now, as we know, obviously, cyber attacks are attacks or attempts made to gain access to unauthorized information through the unauthorized routes or without getting permission to those routes. So in some cases, what we do see is that the main reason or motive of people doing cyber attacks is to ask for ransom, which is basically money. You would see that a lot of attacks which happen online typically end up at some stage or the other boiling down to the fact that these people are essentially asking for damages or money in terms of compensation, that they would say, okay, we'll expose this information or leak this information if this much money is not given. And the reason of this being motivated is through the fact that they are commercially motivated in order to look at money in terms of the reasons why these attacks are done. Now, what we also see is that cyber attacks happen daily. Now, some of them we don't even notice. Some of them, we get noticed. Some of them get covered in the news, and some of them disrupt, certain parts of the system or the working of the systems. Now, it's like saying that, we have lots of earthquakes which happen across the globe in different places, but anything under the Richter scale of 7 or 6 essentially, or 5.5 or below, essentially does not cause any major concern because these earthquakes are under the ground, and obviously they lead to no sort of damage to infrastructure on the ground. But it is the same analogy that I can use to draw up that there are lots of different types of attacks will happen, but these attacks sometimes go unnoticed because there are software tools that you have installed and they end up made to the antivirus software or a defender software on your PC or the firewall. And some of these attacks actually go past some of these tools, and they then get noticed because you'll either find your PC slowing down or your PC is acting funny, your data is deleted or the data is corrupted. And that is when you get to see that these attacks have started to happen. Now, because this particular outcome says what are the various types of attacks that we need to look out for. Now, in the attacks that we discussed in Learning Outcome 2, there are a few which are typically more common than others. So the common attacks that we generally get to see conducted by cyber criminals tend to be botnet. Now, what is a botnet? It's a network of devices that can be infected with malicious software. So if you access public servers or data on public servers like Hotmail, Gmail, or some of the data which is stored on CDN servers, what you would generally see is that some of these servers could be infected by what are called malicious viruses or softwares, basically programs. And these programs, when you go onto the site, for example, a lot of softwares that I download sometimes tend to be from ZDNet, which is a website. Now, this is a software which a company or a website which basically tests out a lot of softwares in terms of performance, and obviously then makes them available free if they are freeware, from a point of view of the company. But sometimes downloading it from these websites or these sites can also mean that there could be some sort of tracking or malicious programs which could be installed on the back of this software. Because when you download the executable files, these files you would execute on your PC to install it, but they will also install other programs in the background. So sometimes these sites or attacks which are called botnets typically tend to come across from sites wherein these are sites which provide freeware or freemium software or information, and you have to be careful about these kind of attacks which happen from these shared sites from which software data information can be downloaded. The second one that we want to be aware of is malware. Now, malware is basically short form for malicious software. Now, this includes anything from being spyware, ransomware, viruses, or worms. Now, malware breaches can happen on a network because of 3-4 reasons. One, the network is not password protected. The network does not have firewall implemented. And typically, the network has left a lot of areas which are open for access through the API route. And in such cases, that can cause or provide vulnerability. Now, application protocol or API or a protocol interface essentially allows certain types of devices to connect to the network in order to become a part of that network to be able to share data or download data. Now, for example, a simple part of that would be I have my machine and I have shared one folder on my machine which other colleagues in the office can access. Now, in that folder, they can read and write, they can put information into that folder, and they can also delete and remove information from that folder because I've given read-write access to them on that folder. And that folder typically has a lot of shared documents that we share, but that folder is open to vulnerabilities. If it gets accessed, if somebody gets an access to our network, then they would be able to access that folder because that folder does not have permissions in terms of asking for password or two-factor authentication, because once you're on the network, we get that folder open. Sometimes you look at printers through the LPT port or through the Wi-Fi port essentially leave some of the vulnerabilities open, because then in that case, if you provide a Wi-Fi password to a visitor who is coming to your office, they would also have access to the Wi-Fi code, and because of that code, they would also have access to any device which is on that network. So in such cases, it becomes easier to execute programs into the network if there are vulnerabilities, or when I say vulnerabilities, there are open access given without additional, I would say, checks like firewall or, for example, password required to log into shared networks. Then in such cases, you could have malicious software or programs being executed on your machine. Now, the third one tends to be phishing. Now, phishing is basically a practice which is going to be looking at sending you fraudulent communication. I received one in the morning today, wherein they said, you could look at download, here's an invoice for the purchase that you've done. And within the attachment, they typically had what is called, a mail attachment in the software. And that mail attachment, if I click on it, would essentially end up generating a program or running a program in the backend, which it would essentially give me an error. But at the end of the day, that program would get executed. And with that execution, what will happen is that program would get installed either on my browser or, on, for example, my machine. And that would mean that somebody would gain access or gain authorized access to my PC. So sometimes you see these kind of emails which come through, which are called phishing emails, and these emails typically are sent over by and I'll show you this particular email, which are essentially sent over by companies acting as actual companies, but at the end of the day, these emails typically tend to be phishing emails because they are looking at installing a program or running some sort of a program on your PC. So give you an example, this was an email which was sent by somebody, and then as you can see, there's a mail attachment here. So this one, I know that we have not taken any such services, neither do we need to solicit any services. So what I ended up doing was straight away deleting this email from the system, because I know that this could be a malicious email, something that I know has no bearing because we have not asked for this. So sometimes you would see that you would get emails for saying that, okay, you won a lottery, or you won this scratch card, and these kind of emails, they come through and they come in basically because they are looking at installing some sort of a programmable code in the background, either on your browser or on your machine. And that would mean that they will get access to, say, some part of your transactions, whether it's spying, whether it's looking at, monitoring activity or diverting traffic, or even using your network capacity to be able to do transactions on your side.
It is like this. Are the spam calls included in phishing? It's like
Yes.
It's a type of phishing.
It is a type of phishing, yes. So typically, mail providers have now created what is called a junk/spam folder, which obviously has been in existence for a number of years. When you look at your emails on cloud-based services like Gmail, Hotmail, Yahoo, Outlook, all of these emails have what is called a phishing or have what is called a spam folder. And the software then has the capability to root out any such email which they think is not a normal email sent across to your email, because the email box and the software is able to monitor what kind of emails you get. And suddenly, if there's something which comes outside of the blue, it basically kind of quarantines it and puts it into the spam/junk folder. Now, when we also look at another attack, which is denial of service attack, this happens when you see 404 pages or it says server not found. And in such cases, these kind of attacks are done in order to exhaust the bandwidth of your resources. So in such cases, what you will see is that if a competitor, say, for example, a competitor essentially wants to disable your website, what it is going to start doing is start diverting a lot of traffic to your site. Now, at some stage, if the site is on a shared server, it might start becoming slow over a point in time. If the server is not able to handle the load in terms of answering the user query, then what will happen is the server would crash. And the server crashing would mean that it is unable to service any more requests of users. Another example that I'll give you is sometimes when you go to public networks, and I would say, for example, you go to the Manchester airport, you get 4 hours of Wi-Fi free. But when you want to get access to the Wi-Fi, you have to put your phone number, your name, and your email address, and it gives you access to for 4 hours. But sometimes in certain areas in the airport wherein you are based or traveling, you would see that even after putting this detail, it still doesn't give you access to the network. It's because of overcapacity. It's because that this router is programmed, or the routers or the network is programmed to support, say, 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 users. But if the capacity in terms of number of users in the airport is higher, then in some cases, it will wait for the user's license to expire, which is 4 hours, and then only you get access to that network. So even though sometimes you go to places like Marks and Spencer, Sainsbury, you'd have access, free Wi-Fi access, which is saying that it's free Wi-Fi from Sainsbury for customers, but you don't get access to it because the bandwidth or the number of requests which the server can actually hold or service is not there. So these kind of attacks, which basically deny you the access to that service, can be termed as what is called distributed denial attacks. And then we looked at SQL injection, when this attack is basically related to the crippling the database of the website, or say, for example, the server. Then in such cases, the SQL injection, which means a malicious program is sent by the attacker to disable the database side of things, would be in such cases looking at disabling the transaction part of the website. An example that I will give you here is, if your website has PayPal integrated into it or any sort of payment system, what sometimes will happen is that these cyber attackers would want to get access to your server, not your website, because the server website will not store the information. The username, if people have come in and done transactions on the site, like for example, you buy heavily on Amazon or on eBay or Flipkart or any other such site, what happens is the data, if you have checked out as a guest, maybe it will not show your data, but if it's your regular customer, the data is actually stored on the server. So what the cyber attackers tend to do is try and get access to the database, which basically has all the information about the customer, the name, the purchase history, the card details if you've stored. And in such cases, when they try and get access to the server, essentially would mean that they are basically using SQL injection as a attack or a type of attack to gain access to that data. And that would essentially be done in a way wherein first they will try and bring down the website. Once the website is down, in the backend, they would try and then get access to the database of the server which services this request. And obviously this is done through a process called SQL injection. A number of malicious programs are installed on the website. When the provider tends to renew or revive the website, what it will happen is it will end up also running some of these programs, which will slowly and gradually install itself on the database and start returning queries, which will remotely put data across to the cyber attackers. Now, you would, in most cases, do not see these attacks because you are, if I look at where we are sitting right now, we have 3 levels of security. The first level of security is we are on a lease line, and the company which provides that lease line has a firewall, Cisco security on it, and which means that there are appropriate firewalls which is on the bandwidth itself, which allows any people to get access to this pipeline. The second part is that when you look at the PCs, on the PCs we have antivirus software installed, which obviously keep looking for phishing emails, malware which keeps coming, and also attacks which can happen through Java or any sort of code which could be executed on the browser, because most machines end up using, when you go to the access and get access to the internet, if the machine comes on the network, then most of the access typically tends to be through the browser. And in such cases, File Explorer browser, that is where the firewall and the antivirus is installed, and they tend to work to control that. And the third part would be that the network administrators also keep running service-related protocols every day, which keep running through what is called the SMS management or system management services, which are called SMS, and they are run from the network server. And these typically tend to look at monitoring the network traffic, looking at where the downloads are happening more, or where the bandwidth is being utilized more. Then they can get alerts to tell them very clearly that there are some issues with one machine or a type of machine which is seemingly using more bandwidth and more resources than required, because in such cases that could be deduced or deducted as some sort of a attack which is happening. So in such cases, it would send across information back to the network administrator or the engineer to say that there's an excessive amount of traffic which is going to this port of the machine or this part of the machine within the network, and this would give them enough indications that there would be some sort of funny thing, or in terms of some sort of a virus or a program essentially running in the background. And this sometimes when it happens is basically done through the process called DNS tunneling. So when we talk about DNS tunneling, a lot of these networks and machines, which actually in our case we look at VPN, virtual private network, and when you look at softwares which are running and protecting the network, essentially you would see that first the cyber attackers would need to attack the network, and the network would then, once network goes down, then they would have access to the machines. So in such cases, when this part of the routine or route that they take to get to access information, then in such cases it would be termed as what is called DNS tunneling. That means they are trying to break into the network, and these networks essentially would then allow them to further infiltrate into the local PCs. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Any questions?
No, it seems a bit stuffed.
Right, okay.
This unit.
Okay.
This learning outcome, I mean.
Yes. Now let's look at an aspect of, what are the various legislations that we see, which are essentially, available in order for protecting in general the information, the systems, the processes, which the government introduces. Now in the UK, these are the types of legislation or acts which have been introduced by the government over the years. And as the let's say the advancements of technology has happened, that means the IT has moved. For example, 1995, we had the introduction of the internet by Tim Berners-Lee. It was previously used as ARPANET and DARPANET by US military side of things. But once he discovered HTTP, then internet started to become available for consumers. In 2000s, you get to see that most of this started to happen slowly and gradually, and we had dial-up modem access, and there was nothing called fiber or fast internet or fiber related internet. But as what I'm trying to say is, as the technology has improved, as we have moved from CDMA to 2G to 3G and other types of networks on telecom side, and also different types of protocols on internet. So today we have Cat 8 type cables. We used to have Cat 5 I would say 10 years back, and that used to support 10/100 speeds. But today you have 1 gigabit speeds available on cable, and then when you have fiber, it can be 1 terabyte. So because the information is becoming accessible because of the increases in technology and advancements in technology, government over the years have also started to introduce a number of pieces of legislation which are related and relevant to the prevention of any sort of breaches which can happen on systems, processes, and PC, for people. So there are these acts that we need to know, which are basically, you don't need to go into details, but these are acts that you need to know. So for example, the first act is Data Protection. Data Protection Act was modified in 2018 or 2016. Essentially, it started when we included the GDPR part of it, which is General Data Protection Regulation. And this particular act has 8 parts to it, which were changes introduced in the original act of 1998. And the main part that we understand from a consumer perspective is that data and citizens of EU citizens cannot be stored outside the European Union in terms of its servers. So all the data with Facebook and Meta and LinkedIn and whatever companies is all stored within the European Union. It cannot go outside that. And then obviously it mandated the creation of what is called a data protection officer, DPO. So every organization which signs up to Information Commissioner's Office, ICO, if you're looking at collecting data, if you're looking at storing data, then in such cases, as an organization, you need to have an ICO membership, and that allows you to then access and store data of individuals. And if you have that access, you also in the organization need to have what is called a DPO, or a data protection officer, so that people, consumers, can write to that DPO if they do not want the data to be stored, if they want the data to be deleted, or they want to know what kind of data is stored with the company. Then in such cases, you need to have things like cookie policy on your website, you need to have data protection policy implemented, you need to have a DPO, and all those things are a part and parcel of Data Protection Act or Regulation of 1998 and later on 2018. The government also introduced, yeah, go on.
Yeah. Would you please re-explain the GDPR, general
data. So what I will do is, I won't go into details of it. There is something which is a GDPR document that I will provide. If you want to read into details, that would basically allow you to get into an understanding that when we had the data protection regulation, obviously this is meant to be able to help companies store relevant amount of consumer data. But that storage of consumer data need to be relevant and can only be stored for a number of years. Beyond that, that data has to be deleted. Now, when GDPR was introduced, the regulation included social media, because a lot of data is now created through social media and distributed through social media. So what the government did was it updated the Data Protection Act to include some of these updates, which were long pending from a point of view of updates to the data protection regulation. The GDPR part of it is the General Data Protection Regulation, which under Article 30 included details which were previously not covered in the Act. And one such area that I mentioned to you is creation of what is called Data Protection Officer, which is required in an organization. It also requires it covers social media now. And the third part, which I look at, is primarily something which essentially means that the data of European citizens can only be stored primarily within the European servers. So there is an article which I will share with you. This particular article gives you the details of GDPR. If you want to read into detail that what was new, what were the updates which were done, and why is it important from a point of view of understand. This is an extensive article, which is roughly about 70 pages, but it will give you a detailed guideline. It summarizes what are the changes which have happened, and then in the parts of it, if you want to go into further details, you'll be able to look into it to read, comprehensively, to say what were the updates done to the data protection regulation, and that is what is covered under the GDPR.
Yeah.
Now, so some of these legislations that we see are basically going to be, a bit theoretical, because you need to just make sure that if you're understanding and going to be working within IT, some of these legislations as an IT administrator, as an IT professional, you need to be aware of. There is an act called the Communication Act. This Communication Act applies primarily to telecommunication sector, which is basically companies who are broadcasting, or companies which are mobile companies, or data, companies which are dealing with bandwidth and internet and mobile services. Now, this act also relates and revolves around privacy of electronic communication. How long can an email be stored? How long can a voice call be stored by the provider? What are the various measures which they need to implement in order to ensure that the data and that consumer data remains safe? Can that data then be passed on to consumers? And if it is then provided to consumers or used for marketing purposes, what are the various legislations these companies need to follow? So it is also taking into account making sure that the networks and equipment are not left, which are being used. The Act also specifies what are the latest features and security guidelines which these companies need to implement on their networks so that they do not leave vulnerabilities open. They do not leave hackers, these vulnerabilities do not allow hackers to get access to the information. So, for example, in a couple of months back, there was a lot of controversy around buying hardware related to Huawei, which is Chinese state-controlled, organization. And there were security fears that if we do install Huawei instruments in the networks across UK, then at some stages the government will have some sort of a backdoor to be able to disable these during critical times of operations or get access to information. So the government prints and publishes such guidelines which relate to national security, and they would then have to be followed by these companies under the Communication Act of 2003. Mm-hmm. There is also an act called the Regulation of Investigatory Powers, which is called RIPA in short. Now, this particular act allows the government to do or conduct surveillance on some of these companies and equipments under the interest of investigatory powers. It could be for national security, it could be for detecting incidents which are in planning or which are attacks in planning. And this allows the government to get access to certain parts of the information under this particular act when queried with these companies. There is a very old act which was introduced when computers started to become, household things, or at least they became MS-DOS and, personal computers started to come into the market, the Computer Misuse Act. Now, this particular act also covers a lot of things. So sometimes it means that people cannot get access to a PC and look at the data or the information on the PCs. It also means that you cannot intentionally or facilitate commit any such crime which can be done from other PCs. So if I go back 20 years, what would we see is that sometimes employees just sort of fun or malicious intent or basically evil intent, they used to do is install certain software on a colleague's PC. And that would install, some sort of, say, software which would be inappropriate or would not be allowed by the company to be run within the company guidelines. So in such cases, getting access to the PC and having access to somebody else's information on the PC is also debarred, by the Computer Misuse Act. The government has also introduced which is called the FIU Act, Freedom of Information Act. This allows, government agencies, semi-government agencies, broadcasting organizations like BBC, Sky News to get access to information under the Freedom of Information Act. They can go to public departments and, subject to a number of exemptions, obviously sensitive data or sensitive information related to national security cannot be, they can't get access to that, but they can ask and get hold of information which is in the public interest, and this is under the Freedom of Information Act. Sometimes you get to see in the news that BBC News presenters say under the Freedom of Information Act, we've got this particular data, from the company. And that would be something that they can access to or get access to under this act, because that information is going to be provided to the members of public, and that information and requests which can be made to gain access to that information is obviously done under this particular act called the FIU Act of 2000. Then there is Privacy and Electronic Communication Act. This is normally a part and parcel of Data Protection and Computer Misuse Act, which is normally implemented for emails. And specifically when consumer data is used for direct marketing, or when consumer data is shared and collected over websites and then it is sold across to different vendors for the purposes of marketing. So this data, an example of this I would give you is that all companies which use consumer data for marketing have to, for example, use and include what is called an unsubscribe button in their communication. And that unsubscribe button should allow consumers to unsubscribe from their mailing list, because this is something that they are not interested in subscribing to, or this is information that they have never consented yes to apply to get hold of. So in such cases, privacy can be respected, but has to be respected for consumers if when you send an email or email related campaigns or mobile related text messaging, then in such cases consumers have the option to opt out of these, communications. Then you have the Official Secret Act of 1989, which is an act introduced by the government because the government can deny access to certain information on the basis of that this information is very confidential. This information is primarily, related to national security or defense secrets. And in such cases, the government can refuse providing that information under this particular act. In some cases, the government can also seize information related to being present on different servers, PCs, machines, just because this information is essentially required for defense purposes or secret missions or national security. Now, the latest act which was introduced, which is of interest, is the Digital Economy Act of 2010. This particular act was introduced by the government essentially, in 2010 because of the growth of social media, the proliferation of the internet, and the proliferation of PC and internet-related devices. Internet was not only accessible through PCs, but tablets, mobile phones, smartphones. So the Parliament introduced this particular act, and this particular act essentially looks at protecting, data which is online, but it includes things like copyright infringement, internet domains, and media content which is published by local radio, television, and gaming networks. So it included what is called the copyright infringements, which is the major component of it. If you are publishing data on social media or publishing data online, and if you're a radio network, television network, a gaming network, or for example, a YouTuber or a social blogger and things like that, you would need to respect copyrights and copyright infringement. So some part of this, when it was introduced, it basically was aimed at ensuring that owners or actual producers of content were still having the ownership of the content rather than people blatantly copying those contents for the purposes of use in their own commercial gains. Now, there are lots and lots of different types of acts which I've listed here, and my suggestion would be to make yourself aware of some of these acts, because some of these acts, like the Counter-Terrorism and Security Act, would be related to cybersecurity. Because this is one act wherein the government can get access to your information, your PC, your mobile phone, your WhatsApp communication, data which is stored on the cloud under the pretext of security reasons or terrorism related reasons. And these are all acts which have been introduced by the government in order to secure the national security of the of the country, and in some cases for the benefit of ensuring that members of public are kept safe and they are kept out of the harm's way. So if there are developing events or events which are happening, then in such cases government can invoke these acts to ensure that information they can get access to the information, and that access to information helps them in preventing bigger incidents which can happen, or any sort of incidents first, and then even bigger incidents which can happen, which can cause damage to life, property, and even offer risk to the life of individuals.
Yeah.
Okay. Any questions on this?
No.
Okay. The third assessment criteria talks about policies that could be implemented in a chosen work environment. Now, when I say policies, here we are looking at not quality policies. We are looking at, say, for example, as a college, we have lots of policies: plagiarism policy, quality policy, health and safety policy, data protection policy, distance learning policy. No, we are not talking about those policies. We're talking about policies in the context of IT. Now, there are lots and lots of different types of policies which can be implemented, primarily for the purposes of securing, the digital environment within a particular location. Now, these policies which we talk about, in the terms of digital environment, would typically include instruments or devices, which would essentially mean that every company which is dealing with data or storing customer data needs to have them in some shape or form, depending on how sensitive data they're dealing with or how much data they are storing. Now, one of the statistics is that 95% of cybersecurity breaches are caused by human error, right? These breaches happen because the security protocols have not been set correctly, the settings on the machine have not been done properly in a way, and training is not done for employees to keep them out of the harm's way when they are using these devices. For example, You bring it. Now, I know a couple of years back, some companies started a BOYD scheme. Do you know what is a BOYD scheme?
No.
Okay. A BOYD scheme was called Bring Your Own Device. Rather than companies giving you a PC or a Mac at the office for work, because sometimes it's easier for companies to say you can bring your own device, and that device you can take back home, because then it allows you to take your work home as well. And you can continue working from home as well if you're not well. So this scheme became quite popular during COVID, and before COVID also it was introduced by some of the companies which have remote workers. And this allowed devices to be seamlessly brought in and brought out of the network. So when you come to office, you bring your machine in and it straight away plugs into your network through Wi-Fi and other bits. And when you take it out, it goes out of your network and it works in a normal way in your home network as well on the router. Now, there was some implementation of security protocols which had to be done to ensure when that device, which is also used publicly at your home in a different network, comes to the office network, so it should not exploit or open some of the vulnerabilities when that device is being used within the office, because it becomes a shared device. So in such cases, it was found out by research that 95% of all cybersecurity breaches happen because of human error. So sometimes you would see employees, when they are given devices, they have VPN network installed on it, or they have two partitions or two drives or logins created. So they have a home login and they have a home office login. But when they are in office, they log in through office, but the data in the drive is shared. But the data in drive, which is shared on the same computer, tends to have certain policies which are installed, which allows the root folders not to be shared, which are system folders, but it still allows them to have data access to what you call shared folders, like My Documents or other folders which users create, which do not have system related files, either Windows or Apple or whatever, or iOS and things. So in such cases, when we look at implementation of these policies, that is what we are talking about as an example of bring your own device, that the network administrators need to be able to implement on the device. So when we talk about these policies, we are looking at policies, or policies means software or enablement of this software on the network and on the devices, which include firewall, switches and hubs, bridges, routers, and wireless access devices. So if you have a small office or if you work within a small place, normally what will happen is there will be a Wi-Fi router and the network and the telephone line plugs in and you work through a Wi-Fi router. This normally happens in the house. But in that router, the provider, if it's BT or EE or whatever version, they will program the device in such a way when it comes, it only works on their network. Have you seen that you can't use a BT router into a Virgin, or a Virgin router into an EE, or EE router into Vodafone, because these devices are pre-configured with those security protocols or policies implemented on it. So they only recognize their network. So when we do talk about these policies, that is what is the set of policies we are looking at when we look at a network. So a PC might be connected to another PC, but in between you have a router, you have a firewall, and if the router is allowing the access to the internet, that is the cloud, it will still have another firewall or some sort of Windows or some sort of a software on it, which is going to disable some of the policies before the device connects to the cloud. And these kind of policies are required to be looked at when we do talk about implementing them in a work environment. Now, this is technical, but what does it mean from a user point of view? For me and you as common man, what does this mean? Now, if I give you a PC or if I give you a laptop and I don't put a password into it as a company and say, okay, you can use this for work and use it at home as well. Now, if you lose that laptop while traveling, first thing which will happen is the device has no password on it. So what will happen is somebody who finds it can easily get into your device, clean it, wipe it, reformat your hard drive, and then sell it in the market and make money out of it. So the most basic thing which you would implement in terms of a policy is have a very secure password. And that password could be a combination of 8 to 10 or 12 letters, depending on how the company policy is. And that password would be an alphanumeric password, and that password would be reset or would require to be changed every 72 days. Because when you save your password in the browser today and somebody gets access to your browser when you're on a public network, all the passwords can be hacked and they can be put onto a site called password leaks. So in such cases, these are default policies which would have or have them implemented in an organization which would say on your device, you need to have a password. It needs to be alphanumeric. It needs to be minimum 12 characters long. And the password needs to be reset or changed every 72 days. And that would disable getting access to the device at the easiest possible level, because you have this particular policy implemented on a device and the user understands this is the basic bit that I need to do. Okay. Then when we look at something called penetration testing, now this is something which allows the network administrators to check your machine remotely to see whether are there any vulnerabilities. Now, what does that mean? Generally, what happens is a network administrator, if you're using a laptop or your PC in the office and he sits somewhere on the first floor in a large organization, you're sitting on the third floor, the network administrator does not need to come to your machine to see whether your machine is updated. Does it have an update happening? So what will happen is they will install some of these updates at a time wherein you're not in, during the night. These updates could be updates to the operating system, could be updates to the virus database, antivirus database essentially, or certain policies and updates which need to happen to the network. And they would be installed and done over time to ensure that the PCs and the devices that you're using are absolutely up to date, having no vulnerabilities. Now, this penetration testing is done essentially to randomly check whether any of the device in the network has not applied that update. Example, one of the employees is on annual leave and has not used the PC for 2 weeks. Now, there are 2-3 updates which have come in the background. The network administrator knows that this particular device can become vulnerable when it is switched on the next time. So what the network administrator would then do in that case is remote re-update that machine, to ensure that the updates are applied and it basically removes any vulnerabilities. So this kind of a testing is normally done by the administrator to check whether there are any options open or any windows or doors which are left open in the network for hackers, essentially. And they would run this by running certain softwares, which are basically going to test vulnerabilities, which are going to test whether the system has any viruses or any malicious software installed. And this would essentially be under the scoping of what is called the penetration testing, to test if the machine is old. Now, one of the things that management and network administrators and IT managers look at, if they see that, okay, our network is essentially having, say, for example, Windows 11, but there are a few machines which are also Windows 10, and there are a few machines which are Windows Vista, and 1 or 2 which is Windows XP. Now, because Windows or Microsoft has stopped support for Windows XP and Windows Vista, if there is any such machine on the internet, on the network within the office, one of the things the network administrator is going to do is check whether the machine can handle the new operating system or can it be upgraded. If not, then that machine is normally taken out from the network and used for maybe standalone purposes. Or in some cases, it is sent for recycling. And that is because that machine, if brought on the network, because now Microsoft has stopped providing support on their existing operating system or the previous versions, would leave a lot of vulnerabilities open on that side, and that is where that machine will become unsafe to be present on the network. So in that case, this is normally done through that particular route. And then when we look at exposure to reducing cyber attacks, obviously the National Cybersecurity Center, NCSC, recommends lots and lots of different things which network administrators, IT managers, or people who are managing the networks in large organizations can do. They can obviously look at doing trainings for the employees. If there are regular trainings done, these could be yearly, this could be once in 3 years, depending on how upgrades are applied or how changes are done within the company's infrastructure. This could be looking at implementation of security measures at the delivery partner end, which is the provider's end. It could be looking at what breaches have happened in the past, in the last 5 years, and seeing if their networks are secure to those breaches. And then if there is a breach which is to happen, then how do they look at risk mitigation and control? So those are things which have been specified by the National Cybersecurity Center for them to look at in terms of policies and policies implementation. At the bare simplest level, I have explained 2 types of policies which could be implemented, but One, we look at password, which is at the individual level. Second, it could be the penetration testing, which is typically required to be done in smaller organizations with network. But there could be other policies related to if there is a network which has firewall, they have multiple servers, they have data on the cloud, they have bridges or routers. If you have virtual private networks, and if you have a WAN, for example, you have a branch office in Manchester, but you also have a branch office in Birmingham, that would mean that you would have to have a WAN between the two offices for a wide area network. And in such cases, the connectivity is going to be through WAN or maybe some sort of fiber, and there would be policies or firewalls and software which would need to be installed on that to reduce any sort of hacks which can happen, on that side. Now, there's a very good video that I would want you to watch, which is 10 steps to secure machines or people and processes by looking at preventing cyber attacks. I put the link here, and this is a good video on the YouTube which you can watch, which basically talks about various ways through which you can reduce cybersecurity attacks. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. The next assessment criteria is how do we look at prevention methods? One is obviously these attacks can happen, but the other is how do we prevent these attacks to happen? Just like in your home, when you leave the house, you lock it, isn't it? You don't just leave the house open, right? Although I hear that people in Dubai, they say you can leave your car on the street, or you can leave your house open, or you can leave your jewelry, nobody steals it. But if you ask me honestly, I don't know whether this is true or not, but generally when you look at, preventing, you are looking at doing away or disabling the things which would essentially invite people to come in and attack or come in and get access to this information. So this particular assessment criteria talks about how do we look at reducing these attacks? What are the things that we do as user, as organization, as a business, or as a provider to be able to prevent these attacks? Now, there are lots of things that can be done, and there are a few that I've discussed in these slides. The most important is training for the staff. If you have the staff which is IT aware, they are trained, they understand that these are things can be done, these are things which cannot be done, these are things which they should not install, and there are certain policies which are implemented. Like sometimes you see in offices, what will happen is the users will not have administrative right. They will not be able to install software on their machine without the network administrator coming in and enabling that. And that is because it allows them to standardize and see whether this particular installation of the software or plugin would cause or give any vulnerability on the system or cause any, let's say, gap in the security. So in such cases, training of staff is important. Making them aware of things that they can do, cannot do, making them aware of the acts, the Cybersecurity Act, the Data Protection Act, the Communication Act, the Computer Data Misuse Act. And these in general, if they are aware of, then if I'm aware, I would not knowingly commit this particular mistake, because as I mentioned, statistics and research has been done which shows 95% of these attacks happen because there are breaches which are caused by human error. Oh, I didn't know about it. I installed the software, it came in and I thought it'll be good for me and I installed it. So that is because you don't have knowledge and you do not have information. The second bit is keeping your systems and software fully up to date. So when an update comes, it is generally, if it's a small organization, normally it is advised to the employees that when an update is available, please update your system so that any such patches or updates which are system related, which is operating system related, can get installed. But in most cases, large organizations or medium organizations, this is something which could be done remotely by the system administrator. Then we also talk about backup of data. That means sometimes it is recommended that you regularly back up your data, simply because if your machine gets corrupted, your hard drive crashes, or in some cases, if there are any attacks which happen, you can lose your data. So backup of data is normally done in network related machines. And in such cases, what happens is that data is backed up in the evening, every evening or overnight, so that your data is secure, even if in the case an attack is to happen. Then there are policy guidelines implemented because of cybersecurity on Wi-Fi networks. The passwords tend to be very strong. If they are given access to guest services or visitors, there's a network created specifically for them, which does not allow them to get access to the entire bandwidth. There are policies which are implemented, which means that once the network router gives access to the device, it scans the device to see whether it meets the minimum requirement. Sometimes what happens is, like if you go to the public network, and if you have a Windows machine that is not up to date and you try and get access to free Wi-Fi, the Wi-Fi will refuse that access. It will say your machine or your Windows is not up to date and it is not recognizing the system. And that is done primarily to vent off machines or systems which are not up to date, which could leave the network open to vulnerabilities if they were given access to the network. So in some cases, you install these policies on the Wi-Fi routers so that they disable or do not give access to machines which are not up to date or devices which are not meeting the minimum set of security protocols. Then you have access to personal employee accounts. Normally in offices, personal information is kept separate and employees are briefed on the fact that you should not use the office machine for your personal reasons because it creates logs. It will create and download data and passwords, and storing them on the office machine would leave your account to some sort of attack and vulnerability. So personal data is normally denied access. And then access management. One of the clear things that you normally have, as I gave you an example earlier, was there are rights which are kept within the PCs and systems so that access management can be done. That means you do not have the right to install a software on your machine. Only your manager can authorize it, or you need to look at getting permission to be able to install that software. And that is normally done through access management. So you'd have an administrator password or a supervisory password to be able to access systems, drives, or networks wherein sensitive information or data is stored. And that could be done through the use of what is called access systems. Is that okay?
Mm.
So the last assessment criteria we have is how do you protect systems, people, and processes? Now, this is something that you would need to read about. There are 2-3 articles which I've put, which I would say that you need to read to be able to understand how do companies look at implementing a system or a web to protect both system, processes, and people within the organization. And these articles would give you a bit of detail in terms of how this is done in a real-time world from a practical point of view in an organization. So when we do talk about people, systems, and processes and technology, this is what normally companies would do. So when we look at people, they would look at training and awareness days, things that you cannot do, can do. When you join in as a new employee in an organization, you're issued a device, you're given a proper training on it in terms of what can be done, what should be done, what is the minimum requirement that you should use to be able to, or put to use to be able to make use of that device. And what the company would also do is ensure that they are giving you a device which is competent enough to be able to do those functions which they require you to do. Processes would mean you are making them aware of regulation, acts, and also best practices, and when audits can be done on the device. And technology would be technology which the company needs to deploy on the device to ensure that they have remote access to the device, they can disable the device, they can wipe out the device, they can install updates to the device, and that would be all done through the system management software or SMS services through the network server in large organizations. In small organizations, it would be primarily done by bringing your device in for an audit once a year, or depending on how frequently you use it or how frequently you change it or take it that way. Now, in this case, one of the things that you need to be aware of is ISO 27001. Now, there is obviously International Standards Organization used to be a benchmark used primarily in engineering and production companies in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. But as things have evolved, there are lots of different international standards organization certifications which have come in. And the 27001 is a security standard which is primarily, applied to data and data related, features within the organization. Now, if you're seen to have a certification from ISO and that has 27001 certification, then it means that as an organization, you're conforming to some international security standards on how data is maintained, stored, and retrieved within your organization. Now, there are lots and lots of different, I would say, regulations or rules within this particular, part. But the most important part is within the ISO 27001 framework, you have what is called the Information Security Management System framework. Now, this defines if your organization has this certification and wants to apply and get this certification, it gives generally a lot of confidence to buyers, consumers, consumer websites, and other things to be able to say that there is an advanced level of information security management system which is utilized and installed within the organization. And this system can be used within companies of all sizes from all sectors. And there is guidance given by the ISO team to be able to apply how to establish these standards, how to maintain these standards, how to implement them, and how to continually improve them to ensure that information is secured within your organization. So this particular system is quite important in organizations which deal with web commerce or data servers or organizations which essentially collect a lot of consumer data. Now, would you buy online from a website which primarily has a lot of these systems installed? Because then it gives you a lot of confidence and faith to say that there are lots and lots of firewalls and lots of things which the company has done or initiatives which the company has taken to be able to secure consumer data. And if you have these certifications in place, what it shows is that the company is serious about cybercrime. It is actively looking and seeking out any sort of threats which could constantly emerge. And because the organization has implemented the best security features, the best protocols, and the best policies in context of IT, it is able to minimize or make hacking of data or information on their devices and their servers and their networks almost impossible for cyber attacks and cyber criminals. So any organization which has implemented this as a system, as a certification, like for example, in people's organization, we have something called investor in people. This is a certification standard. If you apply to, it says that as a company, we care for our employees. We have, policies which are employee friendly and things like that. So it is a certification which is now recognized in the industry. Similarly, in terms of cybersecurity, this is a benchmark or a certification which ISO has created. And if you have, as an organization, this certificate, you can advertise it on your website or on your literature, on your collaterals, and it gives a seal of confidence to the consumers or people who deal with you, because it shows that as a company you have a holistic approach in managing information and information related matters which prevent cyber crime and obviously cyber attacks on their website servers or facilities. Is that okay?
It's used to build the consumer trust.
Correct. There are lots and lots of these things which you can look at, because sometimes companies would get into certification like this. They would install service, SSL layer, which is 128-bit encryption. They would have certain things like cyber laws or cybersecurity laws enacted on their website, either that's shown last time on the Barclays website or some of the websites wherein they have the cyber essentials enabled, which is a certification which you have to get as a company because it shows that you meet certain of these guidelines and you have the basic minimum requirements. And then is when that accreditation or that achievement is given to you, which shows that you have security which is over and above other websites. And that gives consumers the confidence to deal with you and obviously, interact with you through the various options that you give. And they know that very clearly their data is not going to be mishandled or their information about them is not going to be mishandled. Is that okay? So that brings us to the end of today's discussion. Any questions on this so far?
No.
Right. So we'll meet up tomorrow, and obviously we'll discuss Learning Outcome 4. I will provide a copy of the GDPR, on Moodle, but I will also upload, this on the WhatsApp group along with a copy of the recording, just in a couple of minutes after this session.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
When will be our session tomorrow?
Tomorrow
what
it'll
time?
be 2 p.m. again.
2 p.m. Okay.
We'll have our sessions every week, this week at 2 p.m.
Yeah. So after we finish Learning Outcome 4, we're going to be able to start our assignment and finish it
Yes,
then start another unit.
that's correct. Yes, next week, hopefully, you should be starting another unit.
Next week. Okay.
Okay, no worries.
Okay. Thank you
Okay,
very much.
thanks, Shaima. Take care. We have 1 or 2 students which have joined this course. So hopefully Daniel and I think there's another person, they would be available, and they should also be joining. We didn't want them to join from the middle of the unit. So they will be joining us in the sessions, when you have the second unit delivery with another lecturer, they would be starting with you. And there would be a bit of interaction. Hopefully that could happen when these sessions are done.
Yeah, okay, that would be very helpful.
Okay, good stuff.